The $7,000 check, financial motive and opportunity analysis. We've traced the circling pattern through that house, followed the concentration of evidence around the butler's kitchen, mapped the pathway between floors that someone traveled during those staging hours. And now we need to pause at something that sits quietly in the police reports, something that was photographed and documented, but perhaps not examined with the weight it deserves. Above that small catch-all sink in the hallway, near the butler's kitchen, the same area where the notepad and pens were found, there was a check, not just any check, a check for $7,000 made out to John Ramsey from his business partner. It was sitting there, visible, in the exact zone where the staging materials were assembled. And we have to ask ourselves, is that coincidence? Or is that check sitting in that location during those hours, trying to tell us something we've been reluctant to hear? Let's establish what we know about this check before we begin to interpret its presence. From a factual standpoint, it was a business check, $7,000 from the company co-founder to John Ramsey. Business partners exchange payments regularly, so the existence of such a check isn't inherently unusual. But its location matters. Its timing matters. And most significantly, the fact that it was there, visible and undisturbed, in the precise area where someone was assembling the elements of a staged ransom scenario. That proximity refuses to sit quietly in the narrative. We're not claiming to know exactly what that check represents. We're simply noting that it was there, in that spot, on that night, mere steps from where a ransom note was being constructed that demanded a very specific amount of money. An amount that, while not matching this check, existed in the same conceptual universe of significant business transactions and financial obligations. Theme 1. The Geography of Money. Botany. Financial documents reveal about consciousness. When we think about staging a ransom scenario, we need to ask ourselves where the concept originates. From a psychological perspective, people don't create narratives out of nothing. They draw from what's available in their mental landscape, from what's been on their minds, from anxieties and pressures that already exist. The ransom note demanded $118,000, a strangely specific amount that has prompted endless speculation about its significance. Was it tied to John's bonus that year? Was it a number pulled from thin air? Or was it representative of something else, some financial pressure or awareness that was already occupying space in someone's consciousness? And here, sitting above the catch-all sink in the very area where the note was likely written, was tangible evidence of business finance. $7,000 changing hands between partners, not the same amount but the same language, the language of significant business transactions, of money owed and money paid, of financial obligations between people tied together in commercial enterprise. From a criminological perspective, we need to understand how staging works psychologically. When someone constructs a false narrative, they typically incorporate elements from their actual experience and concerns. It's nearly impossible to create something completely fabricated. The mind reaches for what it knows, for what feels real, because it exists in some form in the person's actual life. So if someone was under financial pressure, if business concerns had been weighing on them, if there were anxieties about money or obligations or partnerships, those concerns would leak into whatever story they constructed under stress. The ransom scenario itself, demanding money, referencing business connections, the entire frame of this being about wealth and access to significant cash, might reflect not just what felt plausible as a cover story, but what was already present in the mind of whoever wrote that note. And the check sitting right there in the staging zone becomes a kind of Freudian slip made manifest in physical evidence. Let's think about this from a philosophical angle. We've talked before about how the body preserves truth through lividity and rigor, how biology doesn't cooperate with constructed narratives. But physical objects in space can also preserve truth, can bear witness to what was really on someone's mind during those hours. The check wasn't hidden away in a drawer or filed in an office. It was out, visible, in the exact area where someone was moving repeatedly while assembling the staging elements. They passed that check multiple times, getting the notepad, retrieving pens, perhaps pausing at that sync area to think or rest between tasks. And yet they didn't move it, didn't tuck it away, didn't seem to register that its presence might eventually prompt questions about the connection between real business finances and the fictional ransom scenario being constructed mere inches away. That lack of awareness, that failure to see what the proximity might reveal, tells us something about the state of mind during those hours. Tunnel vision, perhaps, or a consciousness so saturated with financial concerns that the check's presence didn't register as noteworthy because money was already what they were thinking about. From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that money carries meaning beyond its numerical value. In cultures built around capitalism and business success, financial transactions represent not just exchange of currency, but markers of status, security, obligation, power dynamics between partners and colleagues. A $7,000 check between business associates isn't just money changing hands. It's a statement about the relationship, about success or struggle, about who owes whom and whether obligations are being met. The fact that this check was present in the house, visible in a semi-public space rather than immediately deposited or filed away, might tell us something about the state of business affairs, about whether this represented routine payment or something more fraught. We're not claiming to know what the check meant specifically. We're simply noting that it was there, and that its there-ness in that specific location during those specific hours creates a resonance with the financial narrative being constructed in the ransom note. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about stress and how it affects attention and awareness. When someone is operating under extreme duress, staging a scene, writing a detailed note, making impossible decisions about how to protect a surviving child, their perceptual field narrows. They focus intensely on the immediate task, while peripheral details fade from awareness. So the person might have walked past that check dozens of times during those hours, might have glanced at it, might even have registered it at some level, but not connected it consciously to the problematic juxtaposition it created with the ransom scenario they were constructing. Under normal circumstances, someone writing a fake ransom note might think, I should probably not do this right next to evidence of actual business finances. But normal consciousness doesn't operate during those hours. The mind is fragmented, focused on survival, on getting through each moment and each task without collapsing under the weight of what has happened. Let's shift to the logical implications. If we accept that the check's presence in that location is not meaningful, that it's simply coincidence, that it tells us nothing about what was on the mind of whoever was staging during those hours. Then we're left with a remarkable string of coincidences. The staging materials happened to be in the butler's kitchen area. The person writing the note happened to choose that same area to work in. The note happened to involve a financial ransom scenario, and a significant business check happened to be sitting right there, visible, in the exact zone where all this activity was concentrated. Coincidence is possible, certainly. But from an investigative perspective, when multiple elements that seem related all appear in the same small geographic area during the same critical time window, we have to at least consider the possibility that they're connected, that the check's presence and the ransom scenario's creation in that same space reflect a single underlying reality. Money was on someone's mind. Financial pressure or awareness or anxiety was part of the psychological landscape from which the staging emerged. From a psychological perspective, we need to understand projection, the way our internal concerns and anxieties get projected outward into the narratives we create. If someone was experiencing financial stress, if business concerns were a source of worry, if there were questions about money, or security, or the stability of commercial partnerships, those concerns wouldn't simply disappear during the staging hours. They would be there, humming in the background, influencing choices even when the person wasn't consciously aware of the influence. The decision to frame this as a ransom scenario rather than some other type of supposed incident, that choice reveals something about what felt plausible to the person creating the narrative. And what feels plausible is usually connected to what already exists in our mental landscape, to the concerns and frameworks we're already operating within. The check in this reading becomes almost like a clue the mind left for itself, evidence of what was really present psychologically during those hours, visible for anyone who knew to look at the geography of the staging area, and ask what all these elements might mean when considered together. So when we step back and look at that check sitting above the catch-all sink, mere steps from where the notepad was stored, in the hallway that connects to the butler's kitchen, where the note was likely written, we're looking at something that refuses to be dismissed as irrelevant. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the check's presence in that location during those hours creates a question that demands consideration. Was money already on someone's mind? Were financial pressures or concerns part of what was happening psychologically in that house? And did those concerns bleed through into the staging, appearing both in the ransom narrative that was constructed and in the physical evidence that was left visible in the exact area where that narrative was being assembled? We're not claiming definitive answers. We're simply noting that the check was there, and that its there-ness creates resonances and questions that have never been fully explored or explained. Theme 2, the business partnership, understanding context and connection. We've established that the check's presence creates questions, and now we need to understand what that check actually represented in terms of the business relationship it reflected. John Ramsey was a successful businessman. That's well documented. He had co-founded a computer services company with a partner, and by all accounts the business was doing well. A $7,000 check between partners could represent any number of routine transactions: payment for services, reimbursement for expenses, distribution of profits, settlement of minor obligations. From a logical standpoint, we're not suggesting that this check necessarily indicates financial distress or problems in the partnership, but we are suggesting that its presence, combined with the ransom scenario being constructed nearby, creates a pattern that deserves examination. What was the nature of that business relationship in late 1996? Were there any tensions, any changes, any circumstances that might have made financial matters particularly present in someone's consciousness during that period? From a criminological perspective, when we investigate cases, we look for stressors, events, or circumstances in the period leading up to a critical incident that might have created pressure, anxiety, or altered states of mind in the people involved. Financial stress is one of the most common and most significant stressors in modern life. It affects sleep, relationships, decision-making capacity, emotional regulation. Now, we don't have clear evidence that the Ramsey household was experiencing severe financial distress in December 1996. The business appeared successful. They lived in a nice home. They were planning a vacation. But absence of severe distress doesn't mean absence of financial awareness or concern. Even successful people worry about money, especially when they're business owners whose security depends not on a steady paycheck, but on the continuing viability of a company in a competitive market. The question isn't whether they were desperate. The question is whether financial matters, business obligations, partner relationships, money flowing in and out, were present enough in consciousness to bleed through into the ransom scenario constructed under stress. Let's think about this from an anthropological angle. In American business culture, partnerships are complex social relationships that involve not just shared economic interests, but trust, power dynamics, mutual dependence, and often significant personal connection. When business partners exchange money, when checks are written and payments are made, those transactions carry meaning beyond their dollar amounts. They represent whether obligations are being met, whether the partnership is functioning as it should, whether each party is holding up their end of the arrangement. A check left visible in the house rather than immediately processed might suggest it arrived recently, that it represented something requiring attention or thought, that it was present in the household's awareness rather than simply being routine business paperwork that was filed away without conscious attention. We're not claiming to know what that check specifically meant. We're simply noting that it was there in that space during those hours. From a psychological perspective, we need to think about how the mind under extreme stress reaches for frameworks to construct explanations. When someone is staging a scene, they need a narrative that feels plausible, not just to investigators, but to themselves. The mind seeks coherence even in crisis, reaches for explanations that make some kind of sense within the person's understanding of how the world works. A ransom scenario involving wealthy business people being targeted by criminals who know about their finances. That's a framework that would feel plausible to someone who was already thinking about business and money, whose daily life involved commercial transactions and financial obligations. It's the kind of scenario that might naturally occur to someone whose mental landscape was already populated with concerns about business partnerships, money flows, the dynamics of wealth and security. The check sitting there in the staging area becomes evidence that this mental landscape existed, that business finances were part of what was present in the house, in consciousness, in the psychological environment from which the staging emerged. From a philosophical standpoint, we're confronting questions about motive that have always complicated this case. If we're considering family involvement in staging, the immediate question becomes, why? What would drive parents to cover up rather than immediately call for help? The most commonly discussed framework is protection of a surviving child. If one child took the life of another, parents might make the terrible calculation that they could save one by concealing the truth about what the other had done. But there's another framework, less discussed but potentially relevant. Protection of stability, of the family's social position, of business reputation, and financial security. A scandal of this magnitude doesn't just destroy families emotionally, it destroys them economically and socially. Business partnerships can dissolve, clients can disappear, financial security can evaporate. Now, we're not suggesting that someone would stage a scene purely for financial motives. That seems psychologically implausible in the immediate aftermath of losing a child. But might financial concerns have been part of the complex calculation? Might protection of the surviving child have been inseparable from protection of the family's economic viability? The check in this reading becomes a reminder that business concerns existed alongside family concerns in that household, that financial matters were part of the fabric of daily life, and would naturally have been part of the psychological landscape during crisis. Let's shift to the logical implications of the check's specific amount. $7,000 is significant, but not enormous. It's not the kind of amount that suggests a major business transaction or crisis. From a forensic perspective, the amount itself might tell us this was routine, that it represented normal business operations, rather than something unusual or stressful. And yet, it was there, visible, during hours when someone was constructing a ransom scenario. The ransom note demanded $118,000, not the same amount, but existing in the same order of magnitude, the same conceptual category of significant but not enormous sums of money. 17 times 7,000 is about 119,000. We're not suggesting a direct mathematical relationship that would be reading too much precision into what might be coincidence. But we are noting that both amounts exist in the realm of serious business transactions, amounts that would be significant to people involved in commercial enterprises, amounts that wouldn't feel entirely foreign to someone whose daily life involved business partnerships and financial exchanges. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about how chronic stress, the kind that comes from running a business, managing partnerships, ensuring financial stability, affects the baseline state of the nervous system. Even when people appear successful and stable, even when business is going well, there's an underlying hum of vigilance that comes with being responsible for commercial enterprises. That vigilance doesn't disappear during crisis. It's part of the person's baseline psychological state. So, when someone under that baseline stress encounters an acute crisis, finding that one child has taken the life of another, the existing concerns don't evaporate. They remain, humming in the background, ready to surface in whatever decisions and narratives get constructed. The check's presence might reflect not that business concerns were unusually prominent that night, but simply that they were always present, part of the ordinary psychological furniture of the household, and therefore naturally part of what leaked into the staging process. So when we consider the business partnership context, the check from the partner, the nature of commercial relationships, the baseline presence of financial awareness in a household built on business success, we're not identifying a smoking gun that points to some specific financial motive. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, what we're identifying is context. The check existed in a particular social and economic relationship. That relationship involved money, obligations, trust, mutual dependence, and the check's physical presence in the staging area during the hours when a financially themed ransom scenario was being constructed creates a resonance that suggests money wasn't just part of the fictional narrative. Money was part of the actual psychological landscape, part of what was really present in that house on that night. Understanding that doesn't solve the case, but it adds another layer to our understanding of the consciousness that was operating during those staging hours, a consciousness shaped not just by immediate trauma, but by ongoing concerns, relationships, and the complex web of business and financial obligations that structured daily life in that household. Theme 3, the coincidental proximity when location speaks louder than intent. We've examined what the check represents and what it tells us about the household's business context, and now we need to confront the question that has been sitting quietly beneath this entire analysis. Is the check's proximity to the staging materials meaningful, or is it simply coincidence? From a logical perspective, coincidences do occur. Random chance does place unrelated objects in close proximity. But from a forensic investigative standpoint, when we're trying to understand complex events, we pay particular attention to patterns of coincidence, to moments when multiple seemingly unrelated elements cluster together in ways that might not be random at all. The staging materials were in the butler's kitchen area. The note was written nearby. The note involved a financial ransom scenario, and a significant business check was sitting visible in that exact zone. That's a lot of financial and staging elements sharing the same small geographic space during the same critical hours. Let's think about this from a criminological perspective. When we investigate staged scenes, one thing we look for is internal consistency. Does the staging make sense within itself? Does it reflect careful planning, or does it show signs of improvisation and leakage? Moments when the real psychological state of the person staging breaks through the fictional narrative they're trying to construct. The check's presence undisturbed and visible during hours when someone was creating a financial kidnapping scenario might represent exactly that kind of leakage. Not that the person consciously thought, I'll write this ransom note right next to this business check, but rather that the mind under stress doesn't maintain perfect compartmentalization between what's real and what's being constructed. The real business check and the fictional ransom demand existed in the same mental space because money was part of what was actually on someone's mind. And when we're operating under extreme duress, those mental associations bleed into physical proximity without conscious awareness. From a psychological perspective, we need to understand priming, the way exposure to certain concepts or objects influences subsequent thoughts and behaviors without conscious awareness. If someone was moving through that space during the staging hours, if they were repeatedly passing that catch-all sink area where the check was visible, that check was priming financial concepts, keeping money present in consciousness even if they weren't actively thinking about it. And if they were already anxious or concerned about business matters, even at a low level, even as background noise rather than acute crisis, that priming would have made financial frameworks more accessible when they needed to construct a plausible narrative for what supposedly happened. The ransom scenario might have felt natural, might have emerged organically from a mind that was already primed with business and financial concepts by virtue of moving repeatedly through a space where business finances were literally visible on the wall. From an anthropological lens, we can think about how humans organize space and what that organization reveals about priorities and mental states. Important documents, checks, bills, notices that require attention often get placed in visible catch-all spaces precisely because they need to remain in awareness, to be noticed and remembered until they're processed. The fact that this check was in such a space, rather than immediately deposited or filed away in an office, suggests it represented something that required attention or thought. Not necessarily a problem, but something requiring action or decision. And during the hours when someone was staging, when they were moving through that space repeatedly, that check was there, visible, present, requiring attention. It might not have been receiving because attention was focused on the impossible task of constructing a believable narrative about what had supposedly happened. Let's shift to the philosophical implications of coincidental proximity. We want to believe that intentions and actions align neatly, that if someone didn't consciously intend to create a connection between the business check and the ransom note, then no meaningful connection exists. But human consciousness doesn't work that way. Our environment shapes our thoughts in ways we don't recognize. Objects in our visual field prime concepts that influence our decisions. Concerns that exist at the edges of awareness leak into the narratives we construct. The check's proximity to the staging area might be coincidental in the sense that no one consciously thought about the relationship. But that doesn't make it meaningless. It might mean the opposite, that the relationship was so deeply embedded in the person's psychological state that it didn't register as notable, that money and business and financial obligations were so much part of the baseline consciousness that their presence in both the real evidence, the check, and the fictional narrative, the ransom note, went unnoticed by the very person creating that narrative. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about attention under stress and what gets noticed versus what fades into background. The human visual system is designed to notice changes, novelties, things that stand out from their context, but objects that have been in the same location for a while, objects that are part of the familiar landscape, can become essentially invisible. We look right at them without consciously registering their presence. If that check had been sitting in that catch-all space for days or weeks, if it was part of the familiar visual furniture of that space, then someone staging in that area might have passed it dozens of times without consciously seeing it, even though it was literally in their field of vision. The check's invisibility to the person staging, the fact that they apparently didn't think to move it or hide it or recognize the problematic proximity, might tell us it had become part of the background, so familiar it didn't register. And things that don't register consciously can still influence us, can still prime our thoughts and shape our choices in ways we never recognize. From a logical investigative standpoint, we have to ask ourselves, what would we expect to see if financial concerns were part of the psychological landscape during those staging hours? We would expect to see exactly what we do see. Evidence of business finances visible in the area where staging occurred. A ransom scenario that involves money and business connections. And no apparent awareness on the part of the person staging that these elements might create a pattern, revealing what was actually on their mind. The absence of effort to hide the check or create distance between it and the staging area isn't evidence against the connection. It's evidence for it. If someone had consciously recognized the problematic proximity, they would have moved the check, tucked it away, created separation. The fact that they didn't suggests the connection was operating below conscious awareness. That money and business were so naturally part of their thinking that the check's presence didn't register as creating any kind of problematic pattern. So, when we step back and consider the coincidental proximity, the business check visible in the exact area where ransom note materials were gathered and the note was likely written, we're not looking at proof of some specific financial motive or crisis. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, what we're looking at is evidence of psychological state. The check's presence tells us that business finances were part of the physical and mental environment during those hours. The fact that a financially themed narrative was constructed in that same space tells us that financial frameworks were accessible, present in consciousness, ready to be drawn upon when a plausible scenario needed to be created. And the fact that no one apparently recognized the pattern, that the check remained visible, undisturbed, throughout the staging process, tells us that money and business were so naturally part of the baseline consciousness in that household that their presence didn't register as notable or problematic. The coincidence in this reading isn't really a coincidence at all. It's a window into the actual psychological landscape from which the staging emerged. A landscape where business success and financial obligations were woven so thoroughly into daily life that they naturally, inevitably, leaked through into the narrative constructed under stress, appearing both in the fictional ransom scenario and in the physical evidence sitting quietly on the wall, bearing witness to what was really on someone's mind during those dark hours before dawn. We've walked through the geography of that check, its location, its context, its coincidental proximity to the staging materials. We've examined what it might reveal about the psychological landscape during those hours when someone was constructing a financially themed ransom scenario mere steps from visible evidence of actual business finances. What emerges isn't proof of motive in any simple sense. What emerges is a window into consciousness, into the concerns and frameworks that shaped thinking during those impossible hours. The check was there, the staging happened there, and the narrative constructed involved money and business connections. Those three facts sitting together in the same small space whisper something about what was really present in someone's mind, not as conscious calculation, but as the baseline reality from which all decisions and narratives emerged during the darkest moments of their lives. Next time, we'll continue following these threads, pulling at the places where the official narrative strains against the quiet testimony of objects and locations, and the patterns they create when we finally learn to see them.